speech on November 6, 2024, the Republican U.S. presidential candidate Donald Trump emphatically declared,
"I will not start a war, I will prevent wars."
However, this will not be easy, as from its founding in 1776 to the present, the United States has experienced 248 years of history, of which it has been involved in some war for 231 years, and only 17 years have been truly peaceful. In total, the United States has participated in 114 conflicts and is currently directly engaged in combat in 3 countries, Syria, Yemen, and Somalia, while also funding some other nations in conflict and war, such as Ukraine and Israel. It can be seen that Trump will find it very difficult to halt the wars that the United States is currently entangled.
So why is the United States involved in so many conflicts around the world, and what has war actually brought to America? Video, let.
Does the U.S. wage war to sell weapons? Currently, the U.S. defense industry is considered the most developed in the world. Each year, the world's most powerful nation spends billions on the military, which brings enormous revenue to corporations operating in the defense sector. In the list of the top 100 global military companies by revenue in 2023, nearly half are American, totaling 48 enterprises. Even among the top 6 companies, 5 are from the United States.
Leading the world in military revenue is Lockheed Martin. This company was formed in 1995 after the merger of Lockheed Corporation and Martin Marietta.
Although primarily known as a manufacturer of fighter jets like the F-35, this corporation also collaborates with NASA to develop the Orion spacecraft. Lockheed Martin's defense revenue in 2023 was $64.65 billion.
Ranking 3rd globally is RTX, formerly Raytheon Technologies. This company specializes in producing military equipment, including the Javelin portable anti-tank missile system. RTX's defense revenue last year was $40.6 billion. Ranking 4th globally is Northrop Grumman. This company was established in 1994 after the merger between Northrop and Grumman Aerospace. Its most famous product is the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. Last year, Northrop Grumman received $35.2 billion from the defense sector.
Additionally, among the top 6 military companies by revenue in 2023 are General Dynamics and Boeing, with figures of $33.65 billion and $32.68 billion, respectively. These corporations contributed significantly to the U.S. arms export sales in 2023, reaching a record $238.4 billion, an increase of 16%. Of this, the U.S. government directly negotiated arms export contracts worth $80.9 billion, up 55.9% from 2022. The remaining $157.5 billion came from direct sales by U.S. defense companies to foreign countries. This record figure is due to America's European allies striving to expand their militaries and strengthen defense capabilities after having donated much of their weapons stockpiles to Ukraine. For example, in 2023, Poland purchased Apache helicopters for $12 billion, plus an additional $10 billion for high-mobility artillery rocket systems and $3.75 billion for M1A1 Abrams tanks. Additionally, they spent $4 billion on an integrated air and missile defense, while Germany also spent $8.5 billion to buy 60 CH-47 Chinook helicopters. Bulgaria paid $1.5 billion for 183 Stryker. Norway bought 6 new-generation Seahawk anti-submarine helicopters for over $1.14 billion. Meanwhile, the Czech Republic purchased 24 fifth-generation.
In fact, the U.S. has been the world's largest military spender for many years, so it is no surprise that its defense companies dominate the revenue list.
Specifically, in 2023, the United States spent $916 billion, accounting for 37.5%. For comparison, last year, the 2 countries following were China spending $296 billion and Russia spending $109 billion, much less. Even if the next 7 countries are added, the total is only $882.4 billion, still much lower than the United States. Looking at these staggering numbers, many believe that America profits by starting wars everywhere and selling weapons to the involved parties, essentially creating problems and then selling solutions, thereby. But this assessment is actually a mistake. With a gross domestic product value in 2023 reaching $27.72 trillion, the United States only used 3.3% of its GDP. If both defense spending and arms export sales are combined, the defense industry still contributes less than 4.2% of the U.S. Overall, although the U.S. spends a lot on the military and the revenue from arms exports is not small, unlike during World War I and World War II. At present, the defense industry contributes very little to that prosperity. Thus, currently, it is not that the U.S. wages war to sell weapons, or that its government is manipulated by military corporations. That is, due to frequent involvement in conflicts, the United States must ramp up weapons production to meet enormous domestic demand, and only then consider exporting abroad, the journey to becoming a superpower. In reality, in the past, America began as 13 British colonies on the Atlantic coast, but through wars of territorial acquisition, as well as purchase deals, this nation expanded all the way to the other side of the continent, bordering the Pacific Ocean. Throughout this westward expansion, white settlers continuously clashed with Native Americans.
And with absolute advantage, the settlers began to form a national entity.
And with absolute technological and numerical superiority, they gradually pushed the indigenous people into wilderness areas to seize fertile lands.
Also during this period, precisely in 1823,
President James Monroe outlined America's goal. He declared that the New World and the Old World were separate spheres, so the United States would not interfere in European affairs. But conversely, the powers of the Old Continent were not allowed to seek colonies in the Western Hemisphere. This was the clearest declaration of American hegemony over the region and a manifestation of breaking away from Europe. But for many years afterward, the Monroe Doctrine was more idealistic than practical, because America lacked the naval power to. They did nothing when Britain seized the Falkland Islands in 1833, or later in 1845, when Britain and France imposed a naval blockade against Argentina.
But as America grew stronger, the nation also began to demonstrate its power.
For instance, in 1864, France installed Maximilian I as Emperor of Mexico, but just 3 years later, he was overthrown by the intervention of the Northern neighbor. By 1898, the United States declared war on Spain, thereby gaining Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, while also by 1903, they supported Panama's secession from Colombia and then built a canal through it. After its completion in 1914, the United States immediately seized control of this strategic. While World War I broke out in Europe, the United States still adhered to the Monroe Doctrine, meaning non-interference in the affairs of the old continent. Nevertheless, they still sold goods to the Allied powers, as the British Royal Navy completely. In response, the Central Powers led by Germany attacked American merchant ships and incited Mexico to wage war to reclaim territory. As a result, in April 1917, the United States officially entered World War I, and after 18 months of fighting, the American people say so. Not only that, the country became a leading world power. But then the rapid development of the 1920s led to the Great Depression. And not long after, World War II broke out in 1939. Initially, the Americans continued to remain inactive militarily but chose to support the anti-fascist allies, particularly by imposing strict embargoes on. This resulted in the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, causing heavy losses to the United States. With 2,403 dead and 1,178 wounded, along with a series of. Afterward, they devoted full effort to the war, which ended in 1945 after 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Japan. This also marked the formation of the bipolar world order, with the capitalist bloc led by the United States and the communist bloc led by the Soviet. This period was called the Cold War because the military capabilities of both sides. And with the advent of nuclear weapons, the two superpowers met, but they were frequently involved in wars around the world. By 1950, the first hot conflict of the Cold War period occurred in East Asia when the Soviet and the United States assisted South Korea. The conflict ended inconclusively in 1953, marking the first time the United States. Not long after, on April 7, 1954, President Eisenhower gave birth to the domino,
arguing that allowing French Indochina to fall to communism would create a chain reaction across all of Southeast Asia.
Therefore, the United States actively intervened in the situation in Indochina, providing over along with nearly 23,000 military. Thus, by 1965, American troops were By January 1973, the country had deployed approximately 3. At its peak, up to 638,000 American soldiers were directly involved in the war, accounting for over 18% of the. But the cost was the lives of 58,000 American soldiers and over 3 million. Along with that was an expenditure of up to $600 billion in internal This was the first time the country tasted defeat, and in the following period, it also intervened less directly in conflict. Instead, the United States focused on preventing the spread of communism in the Western Hemisphere, while supporting anti-Soviet forces worldwide. From then on, the two superpowers frequently participated, particularly actively aiding the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, turning it into a quagmire for the Soviets. It can be seen that during the Cold War, the most important goal of the United States, leading both sides to actively engage in conflicts worldwide. Beyond this goal, the United States also sought to control the price of oil, the black gold of the globe. The United States wages war for oil. In fact, since humans began extracting oil in large quantities in the mid-90s, the United States has always been one of the world's leading producers. But due to increasing demand, the United States gradually. By the 1970s, up to 40% of its consumption came from abroad. At this very time, the oil crisis erupted in 1973 when OPEC members decided to stop supplying fuel to the United States, due to its support for Israel in the Yom Kippur War against the Arab coalition. Therefore, oil prices soared from $3.01 to $5.11 per barrel and rose to nearly $12 by mid-1974. Due to fuel shortages, prices in the United States increased by an average of 86%, while GDP fell by 3.2% and the unemployment rate reached 9%. At that time, U.S. President Richard Nixon approached King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, the member with the largest oil reserves in OPEC. As a result, this country only sells oil in exchange for the U.S. agreeing to provide weapons and protect the throne for the Saudi family. This agreement is called the petrodollar and was signed on June 8, 1974. Afterward, other OPEC members also accepted using the dollar for payments. Thanks to the supply of cheap fuel from the Middle East in 1975, the U.S. government decided to ban crude, turning them from the world's top oil producer into an importer of black gold. But this also meant that America became dependent on foreign countries and frequently intervened in the affairs of oil-exporting nations. As in 1979, when the Iranian Islamic Revolution erupted and the newly established government was hostile to the U.S. President Jimmy Carter ordered a halt to oil imports from Iran in response. Within just 12 months, the price per barrel of oil jumped from $15.85 to $39.50. Rising energy prices led to increased inflation, peaking at 13.5% in 1980, forcing the Federal Reserve to implement a series of tight monetary policies. Meanwhile, Iraqi President Saddam Hussein decided to attack Iran, fearing the export of the Islamic Revolution. In that situation, the U.S. strongly supported Iraq, including billions of dollars in economic aid and the sale of $500 million worth of dual-use equipment. The result was a war lasting nearly 8 years, with both sides suffering heavy losses. Facing a severe economic crisis, President Saddam Hussein decided to invade Kuwait in 1990. And this campaign took only 2 days to complete. At that time, Iraq had doubled its oil reserves, from 10% to 20% of the world's black gold reserves. Moreover, if this country mobilized troops to attack Saudi, they could control up to 40% of global reserves and become an energy superpower. And naturally, the United States did not want that scenario to become a reality. They assembled a coalition of 34 countries, with a force of up to 956,600 people, while Iraq had a much more modest force of 650,000 people. Not only did they have a numerical advantage, but the 34-nation coalition was also, with 6 carrier groups deployed in the Persian Gulf, along with 2,200 various combat aircraft. In the end, Iraq was completely defeated and fell into a state of strict sanction.
America's global hegemony. In 1991, after the Gulf War ended, the world received another shocking news.
That the world's second superpower, the Soviet Union, had collapsed. Along with it, the East. At this moment, leaders in Washington realized that America had become the only remaining superpower,
and fully held the position of global hegemony.
At that time, Americans turned their attention to Europe as Yugoslavia also faced.
while Slovenia, Croatia, and Macedonia had all gained independence. The conflict in Bosnia-Herzegovina remained very bloody as both sides carried out brutal ethnic cleansing.
With the strongest force, the Serbs held an overwhelming advantage and were also the side with the most extreme. They perpetrated the Srebrenica massacre in 1995, killing over 8,000 people. This was also when America stepped up to take on the role of world police. In 1995, the entire NATO bloc entered the war, carrying out a series of bombing campaigns, thereby pushing back Serb forces and forcing them to the negotiating table to end the war.
With growing confidence, the United States continued to intervene in the Somali civil war.
But the result backfired as they had to withdraw in humiliation. At this point, America faced the Haitian migrant crisis. This was due to military officers carrying out a coup and overthrowing President Jean-Bertrand Aristide
to take control of the country.
Therefore, the U.S. and its allies defeated the military government to restore the democratically elected. By 1998, the eyes of the White House boss turned back to Europe. When Albanians in Kosovo wanted to secede from Yugoslavia, the Serbs, with overwhelming military, once again carried out numerous massacres, killing 2,000 Albanians in Kosovo and forcing 370,000 people to flee their homes. As a result, the U.S. and NATO continued bombing campaigns, forcing Yugoslavia to allow Kosovo. It can be seen that in the final decade of the 20th century, the United States achieved overwhelming power and intervened in many regions around the world. But also during this time, extremist Islamic forces in the Middle East felt that
their land was being controlled by Christian Americans.
Subsequently, a series of terrorist organizations were established,
led by Osama bin Laden.
They continuously carried out bombings targeting Americans, the most serious being the attack on the Twin Towers on September 11, 2001, which claimed the lives of 2,977 victims. This was a real challenge for the world's #1 superpower.
And immediately, they launched an attack on Afghanistan.
Because at that time the Taliban government had allowed the terrorist organization Al-Qaeda, the conflict lasted only about 2 months, with victory completely leaning toward the U.S.
The American people had not yet calmed their anger,
and the government wanted to find another new enemy,
so they targeted Iraq, the defeated party in the Gulf War.
Thus, the U.S. government accused Saddam Hussein's regime of producing weapons as well as funding terrorist forces.
And in just over a month, they forced the opponent to surrender.
Besides Afghanistan and Iraq, this country also expanded the war on terror globally, especially military adventures in Somalia, Libya, Syria, Yemen, and Pakistan. However, the situation in the Middle East and North Africa did not,
if not becoming more chaotic.
Right at this time, the financial crisis erupted in the U.S. in 2007 and spread globally. As a result, the Middle East North Africa region, already
now erupted in a series of protests during the Arab Spring.
Then conflict broke out in Libya causing oil prices to rise above $100 per barrel. Therefore, the Western Alliance wanted to quickly resolve this, and the simplest way was to support rebel forces by bombing the Libyan army. And after 7 months of fighting, Colonel Gaddafi was forced to surrender. Also in the wake of the Arab Spring, civil war broke out in Syria in 2011. Initially, the U.S. supported the rebels with non-lethal aid, such as rations and pickup trucks. But later, it quickly began providing training, money, and intelligence.
However, this did not achieve the expected effect as the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant grew stronger in both Iraq and Syria.
Thus, the U.S. once again embarked on a military adventure in 2014. Attacking terrorists, fighting government forces, and supporting rebel groups simultaneously. And to this day, U.S. troops are still present in Syria, while also intervening in the situations in Somalia and Yemen, whereas previously, they withdrew troops from Afghanistan on August 15, 2021.
And ended the longest foreign war in history, lasting nearly 2 decades.
America and the endless conflicts. Since the early 1990s, the U.S. has militarily intervened or even launched wars in many regions for various reasons. The list of places where the U.S. has intervened is very long, including Kuwait, Somalia, Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and
not to mention U.S. drone warfare in Pakistan and other countries.
U.S. officials have provided many strategic and moral reasons for their intervention. However, in reality, after their interventions, many countries and regions have fallen into instability. Migration and refugee situations have worsened, while political extremist elements have increasingly risen. Most such crusades have only made the on-the-ground situation worse. Notably, an interventionist trend has not changed much. Most senior U.S. foreign policy officials have still not learned the bloody lesson from past mistakes. They often emphasize that all those missions would have succeeded or been more effective if Washington had acted more forcefully and decisively. In the view of these officials, the problem is not that the U.S. decided to engage in a war, but that it did not fight comprehensively. This notion stands for the belief that the world's #1 superpower can solve every problem, including destroying terrorist organizations, deterring all adversaries, quickly pacifying Afghanistan and Iraq without paying too high a price, or even subduing top powers like Russia and China. However, actual results show that such a policy is completely ineffective. Evidence is that recent U.S. military operations abroad have all failed. For example, the invasion of Iraq that overthrew President Saddam Hussein's regime triggered sectarian conflict between Sunnis and Shias, and then came the rise of the notorious Islamic terrorist organization. This chaos has claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of innocent local people, while also making the U.S. military and its citizens targets for extremists.
While the U.S. military intervention in Libya led to the overthrow of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi's regime,
this North African country has remained engulfed in war flames. After NATO's military intervention in Libya, there were massive migrations from the country to Europe, along with the emergence of open slave markets.
To this day, this North African country remains in a civil war between the official government in the capital Tripoli and the rebel forces of Marshal Khalifa Haftar. As for Syria, the civil war has turned the country into a devastated land,
creating conditions for extremist Islam. While up to over 600,000 people have died and about 6.7 million have become refugees, thereby causing political and social tensions across the Middle East. Especially now, there are increasingly strong and resolute calls demanding that the U.S. administration draw red lines to prevent Russia from restoring its influence and superpower status as an Soviet, as well as to counter China's expansion in the Asia-Pacific region, thereby maintaining its global hegemony. Even some warmongers in Washington openly support waging a war between the U.S. and China and Russia. However, any effort or strategy by Washington to pressure Moscow and Beijing will only make these nuclear powers seek to strengthen their militaries to prove they are not subdued by the U.S., thereby making the world situation increase. So if military intervention has not succeeded in the past 20, why are there still many U.S. officials calling for continuing such campaigns in the next 2 decades? These people still believe the best solution is to continue stationing and fighting troops abroad longer, dropping thousands more bombs on the ground and establishing even more no-fly zones. They don't need to care about the actual consequences of that policy. Nevertheless, there are still many people in it. They argue that we should no longer waste hundreds of billions of dollars, but instead use that money to invest in public services and develop the national economy,
rather than burning money on futile efforts to manage the globe. And above is what war has brought to America. If you want us to cover any topic,
please leave your comments below. Goodbye and see you in the next videos.